Why are you opposed to vaccine passports if this is one of the ways that we can get back to some degree of normality?
I'm opposed to them for a range of reasons. Firstly, if you look at the practicalities of this, there's still no conclusive evidence of the link between vaccines and COVID transmission. And it's still not clear, for example, whether or not if you've been vaccinated, you can still transmit it. And indeed, there's no guarantee that vaccination will offer sufficient protection against new variants. We've got new variants circulating. So there are practical concerns. There are concerns about equalities. We know that marginalized communities are the least likely to be taking up the vaccine. And if we're not careful, we'll be ending up with a two-tier society. We've got concerns around civil liberties and the slippery slope to an ID society. But you know what? I think one of the biggest concerns I have about this is the fact that it is a massive distraction from suppressing the virus through the test, trace and isolate system. Why are we not getting the basics right? The government has spent £37 billion on a test, trace and isolate system that still isn't working because people cannot afford to self-isolate. If they would get that part of the equation right, we would have a much better chance of being able to return to normality, along with much more strict restrictions at our borders, rather than chasing after this vaccine passport idea, which, as Professor Reicher just said as well on your program, could even be counterproductive to people taking up the vaccine. There are so many problems with it.
But
why don't we get the basics right?
But this is not just about vaccinations. This would be a certificate that also looks at negative tests. It looks at if you've built up some immunity because you've had the disease before. Doesn't the public, especially in large venues like football matches or cinemas or concerts, deserve to know that everyone who is with them is protected to some degree? Caroline.
Well, to some degree is kind of giving the game away, isn't it? To know that you're protected to some degree isn't really quite enough, particularly in the context of new variants circulating. So I would say that people would have a much better chance of knowing that they were protected if they knew that people who had got the virus were self-isolating because they could afford to do so. Here in the UK, we have one of the lowest sick pays in the whole of the OECD. We have just 25% of someone's salary is what you get on sick pay if you're lucky. We know as well there are huge barriers to people being able to get the £500 payment, which is supposed to be available for 2 weeks. Many thousands of people can't get hold of that. So let's get those basics right. That is the way to suppress the virus, to get us back to the normality that we all crave, rather than going down this divisive route, which lots of evidence suggests isn't even going to work.
So, Davey, in this last year, we've already seen our basic human civil liberties trampled on by a libertarian prime minister because of COVID. So this is yet another measure, you would say temporary, in the need to deal with the pandemic and then find our way back to normality. So why be against it?
I disagree. The Conservatives said that we were on an irreversible path to freedom. And if we are moving out, as we all hope we are, to open up our society again, we want our freedoms back. Liberal Democrats have been sounding the alarm for many months now. We voted against the renewal of the Coronavirus Act back in the autumn. We voted against the renewal of the Coronavirus Act very recently because it took away our freedoms without being necessary to tackle the pandemic. And that's the same with these COVID ID cards. They're using the word passports. They're not. They're ID cards, where someone at a bouncer at a pub could stop you going in just because you didn't have your papers or your app with you. This would be very discriminatory. It would take away our freedoms. We want our freedoms back, and that's why Liberal Democrats are going to campaign against this cross-party to get a defeat for the government. But it goes even beyond freedoms. It's about how we open up our economy. There are many businesses extremely worried by this government proposal. Businesses are recovering from the deepest recession for 300 years. They've been very disappointed by the lack of support from government, particularly for small businesses and the self-employed. And this proposal has been attacked by representatives of the beer and hospitality industry, by representatives of the cinemas, organisations and businesses who you thought might welcome this if it was really necessary. What people are telling us is that these proposals are unnecessary, unworkable, and deeply illiberal. And what the government should be doing is, rather than wasting huge amounts of money again on an app and a system which probably won't even work after they spent billions more pounds, they should be investing that money into a proper test, trace and isolate system where people who are required to isolate because they've tested positive get real support, both wages, by ensuring their families are supported, by having an option of a hotel where they could self-isolate. These are the sort of support systems that are needed if we're going to make test, trace and self-isolate work.
Caroline Lucas, we already have to show proof of a negative test when we get on a plane. There will be all sorts of requirements if we want to get back to international travel or indeed degrees of international trade. Why not apply the same rules domestically, as long as it can be certain that this is done for a short period of time until we're back to normal?
Well, again, I think the crux is in your question, isn't it? For a short period of time, I think there is a real worry. But once you've invested in all of the infrastructure behind this kind of a scheme, there's every risk that it could be rolled out and stay in place for much longer than
that's a risk, isn't it? There's no proof that that will happen. There's no proof that that will happen.
There's no proof that it won't happen. There's no proof that it won't happen. But you've also heard from both Davey and myself a whole catalogue of reasons why this is not a good idea. Worse than that, as Professor Stephen Reich has said, it could even be counterproductive if it puts people off getting vaccinated because it becomes a much more divisive society. I think right now people want to pull together. They want to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And so many other countries have demonstrated that the way to get to that light at the end of the tunnel is through the test, trace and isolate system.
Right.
I know it's boring to be going on about it, but get it right. You've spent £37 billion on it, government. Get it right, pay people to self-isolate, and then we might just have a chance of that brighter future.
In 20 seconds there, Davey, I wish we had someone from the government here to put their point of view, so I'm doing it for them in terms of a question. If they put a very strict time limit on this, would you accept it? Yes or no?
No, because I just don't trust this government with our freedoms. We're seeing creeping authoritarianism from Boris Johnson, the Conservatives. We've seen it with the Coronavirus Act, which wasn't necessary. We've seen it with the police bill, and now we're seeing it with COVID ID cards. I don't trust these Conservatives with our freedoms, and that's why Liberal Democrats will work cross-party to stop these COVID ID cards.
Got to leave it there. So Ed Davey, Caroline Lucas, thank you very much indeed. John.